She had been told all her life that she was useful. Not loved, not celebrated, not even particularly noticed, but useful. A quiet presence at dinner parties, a steady hand to manage correspondence when her mother's nerves failed, a body to fill a seat when one more was needed. Lady Rose Ellsworth, 26 years old, heiress to a fortune she had never once been allowed to spend as she wished, had spent the better part of a decade learning that in the Ellsworth household, usefulness was the closest thing to belonging. Now, as London's social season unfurled its glittering sails and the ton gathered to judge, to flirt, to ruin and to rise, Rose was about to discover that even usefulness had its limits, and that the most dangerous men were not the cruel ones, but the ones who, without meaning to, made you want to be seen. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped between a merchant's invoice and a note from her sister about a fitting at Worth's. It bore no personal seal, only the crest of Calderwin House pressed into dark wax, austere and angular, like something carved into stone. Rose Ellsworth turned it over in her gloved fingers. She had seen that crest before, in passing, on a carriage crossing Whitehall, on a door in St. James's that was always shut. The Duke of Calderwin did not entertain. He did not receive callers, and he certainly did not write letters to young ladies of modest social standing. She broke the seal. The contents were brief, 3 lines, in a hand so precise it might have been engraved rather than penned. A formal summons dressed in the language of invitation for Lady Rose Ellsworth to present herself at Calderwin House on the evening of the 14th of April to fulfill a social obligation on behalf of His Grace. The nature of that obligation would be explained upon her arrival. Rose read it twice. Then she folded it, tucked it into the pocket of her morning dress and went down to breakfast without a word. The morning room at Ellsworth House in Kensington smelled of toast, bergamot, and the particular brand of silent tension Rose had learned to navigate since childhood. Her mother, the Viscountess Ellsworth, sat at the head of the table with a posture so erect it seemed architectural, reading a letter from her eldest daughter with the focused absorption usually reserved for parliamentary dispatches. Charlotte's letters always received this treatment. So did Eleanor's. Rose's were folded and set aside without ceremony, like receipts one might revisit later if the mood struck. Rose buttered her toast and observed her sisters. Charlotte, 29, golden-haired, had married a viscount at 19. Eleanor, 23, was the beauty of the family, dark-eyed, luminous, currently engaged to Lord Harwick. Rose, by contrast, was neither golden nor luminous. Brown-haired, brown-eyed, with the kind of face that was pleasant in repose and forgettable in company. Her hands were ink-stained from household letters. No one thanked her for writing. And her dress was 2 seasons behind because no one had thought to order her something new. She did not mind. Or rather, she had trained herself not to mind, which was not quite the same thing. Rose, her mother's voice cut across the table, you have not responded to Lord Pemberton's invitation. He is unmarried, not yet 40. He specifically requested your attendance at his musical evening. The implication was plain. Pemberton was not wealthy enough to interest Charlotte or Eleanor, but wealthy enough to be redirected toward the sister no one else had bothered to arrange for. I shall send my regrets, Mother, Rose said. I have no interest in Lord Pemberton. The Viscountess set down her letter with deliberate care, the precursor to displeasure Rose knew well. Before she could speak, Eleanor looked up from her breakfast. Perhaps Rose simply hasn't found anyone worth the trouble, she said, smiling over her teacup. Not everyone can be as fortunate as I. The remark was meant to be light. Rose chose to receive it that way, because acknowledging the quiet cruelty in its cheerfulness would have required a confrontation she did not have the energy to sustain. She smiled back, thin and brief, and finished her toast in silence. The answer came that same evening. Her mother summoned Rose to the drawing-room after dinner, with an expression Rose had learned to associate with decisions already made. The Viscountess sat in her usual chair by the fire, a glass of sherry at her elbow. I have received a communication from Calderwin House. His Grace requires a companion for the remainder of the social season, someone to serve as his hostess at formal events. You will accompany him to Almack's, dinner parties, receptions. You will manage introductions. ensure his social calendar runs smoothly. It is a matter of etiquette and organization, precisely the sort of thing you do well. Rose absorbed this in silence. A hostess, a social manager, a woman hired to smooth the rough edges of a man too proud or too damaged to do it himself. "Why me?" she asked. Her mother's gaze flickered. "Because you refused Lord Pemberton." The words landed like a small, precise blow. Not an opportunity, a consequence. Her mother had offered her a path, and Rose had refused it, and so the Viscountess had found another use for her, one that was less a gift than a punishment dressed in silk. "When does it begin?" Rose asked. "The 14th. Present yourself at Calderwin House at 8 o'clock. The Viscountess paused. "Do wear something appropriate, dear. The Duke is particular about appearances." Rose nodded, rose from her chair, and left without another word. In the corridor outside, she stopped, pressed her back against the cool wallpaper, closed her eyes. Useful. She was still useful. And usefulness, it seemed, had brought her here, to the doorstep of the most formidable man in London, armed with nothing but good posture and the quiet, stubborn certainty that she would not let this break her. The 14th of April arrived with a thin drizzle and a sky the colour of pewter. Rose, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk, 2 winters old but still elegant, pinned her hair simply and wore her mother's pearl earrings. She examined herself in the mirror with detached assessment. Adequate. She looked adequate. The carriage that came for her was black, polished, drawn by 2 bay horses. Rose climbed in without assistance and watched London slide past as they moved toward St. James's. Spring in London was a performance, she had always thought. Everyone playing their part, hoping the audience would applaud. She wondered what part she was about to play. Calderwin House rose at the end of a quiet street like something from another century, a Georgian townhouse of pale stone, its facade as composed and unyielding as a man's face in public. No flowers, no softness of any kind. The iron railings were polished to a mirror shine. A butler met her at the door and led her through an entrance hall panelled in dark wood, lit by a chandelier of wrought iron and crystal. The art on the walls was military, battles rendered in dark, smoke-choked oils. Rose's eyes caught one in passing, a scene of devastation, and in the foreground a single figure on horseback silhouetted against flames. She knew with sudden certainty that the figure was meant to be the Duke. In the library, Mr. Whitmore, middle-aged, spectacled, visibly relieved to see her, explained the arrangement efficiently. The Duke found the rituals of London society taxing. Rose would manage introductions, ensure events flowed smoothly. In return, she would receive a stipend and a certain visibility in society. "There is one further matter," Whitmore said, shifting his weight. "His Grace wishes to meet you, tonight." Rose had not expected this, but she kept her composure steady. "Of course, lead the way." The drawing-room overlooked the street. It was elegantly furnished but cold, no evidence anywhere that a human being actually spent time here. The Duke of Calderwin stood by the window. Rose's first impression was not of his face, but of his stillness. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture so perfectly straight it seemed almost aggressive, the bearing of a man who had spent years holding himself together through discipline alone. He was tall, lean, built for endurance rather than ease. Black evening clothes, dark hair shot through with threads of silver at the temples. Then he turned, and she saw his face. Too angular to be conventionally handsome. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw set in stone, a mouth pressed into a line of permanent restraint. But his eyes were extraordinary, dark, almost black in the firelight, and possessed of an intensity that made Rose feel in a single glance as though he were reading something written on the inside of her chest. She did not look away. She had learned, over years of navigating rooms where she was the least important person present, that looking away was an invitation to be forgotten. So she held his gaze, steadily, with the quiet composure that was her greatest skill, and waited. The Duke studied her, no warmth, no curiosity. Only that measuring look, as though assessing whether something was worth his time. Then something shifted, so slight Rose might have imagined it, a fractional easing around his eyes. "Lady Rose Ellsworth," he said. His voice was low, controlled, with the crispness of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You have come alone, without a chaperone." "The arrangement was made at short notice," Rose said, "and I understood that speed was preferred to ceremony." A long pause. His gaze moved over her face with deliberateness that would have made a lesser woman shift uncomfortably. Rose remained perfectly still. "You have not asked why," he said. "Most women would have questions about the arrangement, about expectations, about me." Rose considered this. She could have been fully honest, admitted the questions, the unease, the strangeness of standing in this cold room before this formidable man. Instead, she chose the version of honesty that cost her the least. "I have been told, Your Grace, that you prefer efficiency to conversation. I thought it more respectful to wait until you asked." The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Warmer. The Duke's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. There and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "A fair assessment," he said. "You have been well informed." "London talks, Your Grace. It is rather difficult to avoid." He inclined his head. Then he turned back to the window, and the conversation was over. Rose offered a curtsy, precise, unhurried, and left the room without looking back. She could feel his gaze on her as she crossed the threshold, steady, assessing, and unmistakably attentive. It was only in the carriage, the wheels rattling over St. James's cobblestones, that she allowed herself to exhale. The first public appearance came 4 days later, at a soirée hosted by Lady Pemberton on Berkeley Square. Not a grand affair. 60 guests, a string quartet, enough champagne to keep conversation flowing, but the sort of event where reputations were quietly made or destroyed, and Rose understood as she dressed in pale grey silk that tonight she would be watched. The Duke was already in the carriage when it collected her, a dark presence in the corner, his face lit in flickering intervals by the gas lamps they passed. He did not greet her. Rose settled into her seat. The silence between them was the silence of two people who had not yet learned how to occupy the same space without the effort showing. "Lady Pemberton will expect an introduction," Rose said after a few minutes. "She is close to the Duchess of Kent. I would suggest telling her this is a seasonal arrangement, nothing more. It will satisfy her curiosity without inviting further questions." The Duke turned his head. In the dim light, his expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something that might have been surprise. "You have done your research," he said. "It is my role to ensure the evening proceeds smoothly. That requires knowing the terrain." He regarded her a moment longer. Then he nodded, and Rose noticed, or thought she noticed, that the set of his shoulders had relaxed, fractionally, as though something he had been bracing for had not arrived. They descended together at Berkeley Square. The Duke's hand, gloved and firm, steadied her elbow as she stepped from the carriage. Brief, businesslike, nothing that could be remarked upon. And yet the contact left a faint warmth on her skin that lingered as they walked toward the door, side by side, in the quiet, companionable silence of two people entering a performance together. Inside, the soirée unfolded exactly as Rose had anticipated. Lady Pemberton descended with the enthusiasm of a hostess who had secured a coup. Rose managed introductions with practiced ease, guided conversation, deflected questions that edged too close to the personal, kept the Duke's champagne glass filled without drawing attention to the act. She became aware of his attention gradually, the way one notices a change in the weather. The Duke's focus, which had been fixed on the middle distance for most of the evening, polite, distant, kept shifting again and again to where Rose stood, not watching her, observing, cataloguing the way she moved through the room, the quiet competence, the way she navigated social currents without being swept along by them. Once, when a particularly vapid countess cornered Rose near the refreshment table with increasingly personal questions, Rose felt his presence before she saw him. He appeared at her elbow, not intervening, not speaking, simply standing there, close enough that the Countess's eyes widened and her questions dried up immediately. The Duke inclined his head to the woman, offered Rose his arm and guided her away with the quiet authority of someone who did not need to raise his voice. "Thank you," Rose murmured. "You did not need rescuing," he said. And then, after a pause, "But she was boring you." Rose almost laughed. Almost. "She was," she admitted. The ghost of that almost smile crossed his face again, quick as a heartbeat, and Rose felt something shift between them. Not warmth, not yet, but the absence of coldness, a crack in the wall, hairline thin, through which something might eventually find its way. The evening ended at 11:30. The ride back to Kensington passed without a word, but when the Duke handed her down at Ellsworth House, his grip on her hand lingered, a fraction of a second longer than necessary before he released her. She appeared at the third event, a formal reception at the Duchess of Devonshire's, like something out of a fashion plate. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe was 19, the daughter of an earl, and possessed of the kind of golden beauty that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. She wore white silk cut close to the body, with a neckline that walked the edge of propriety, and pearls that caught the candlelight and threw it back like a challenge. Rose noticed her immediately, not because of her beauty, but because of the way she moved. Not a young woman enjoying herself, but a woman on a mission, her eyes sweeping the crowd with a precision Rose recognized because she had seen it in the mirror. Beatrice's gaze found the Duke first. It lingered, assessing, hungry, before sliding with deliberate slowness to Rose at his side. Something hardened in Beatrice's expression, not surprise, something colder, something that looked very much like the beginning of war. The engagement was brief and cordial on the surface. Beatrice approached during a pause in the music, introduced herself with perfect grace, exchanged pleasantries with the Duke that were so flawlessly rehearsed they might have been scripted. Rose noted the way Beatrice's hand lingered on his arm, a fraction too long before withdrawing. "What a remarkable evening," Beatrice said, turning to Rose with a smile that was all warmth and no substance. "And you must be Lady Rose. How lovely to finally meet you. I have heard so much." The emphasis on "finally" was subtle enough to be deniable, clear enough to sting. Rose smiled back, pleasant, unruffled. "Lady Beatrice, the pleasure is mine. I do hope we shall see more of each other this season. It is so important to cultivate one's connections." A glance at the Duke, possessive, confident. "But I must not keep you. I'm sure you have so much to manage." She drifted away with practiced ease, and Rose was left with the faint, unpleasant sensation of having been assessed and found wanting. "Lady Ashcombe," the Duke said after a moment. His voice was neutral, but something in it, some barely perceptible edge, told Rose he had noticed Beatrice's manner as clearly as she had. "Yes," Rose said quietly. "I see." He looked at her then, a quick, searching glance, as though asking a question he did not put into words. Rose met it steadily, held his gaze until he turned away. The reception ended late. Rose had spent the final hour managing a conversation between two lords whose political disagreements threatened to become something uglier, and by the time she descended the grand staircase, the composure she wore like a second skin had begun, very slightly, to fray. She did not show it. She never showed it. But when the Duke offered his arm to guide her to the carriage, his gaze swept her face with that quiet attention she had felt all evening, and this time it did not move on. They rode in silence. The carriage rocked gently over uneven streets, lamplight casting intermittent shadows across the interior. Rose stared at her gloved hands and felt the exhaustion settling into her bones. "You are tired." She turned. The Duke was watching her, not with performed sympathy, but with the direct observation of a man who had spent years reading people under pressure and had stopped pretending otherwise. "I am perfectly well, Your Grace." "You are tired," he repeated. "You have been managing that room for hours. Your smile has not faltered once, and that, Lady Rose, is not natural. It is effort." Rose held his gaze. No one had ever said this to her before. Not with this combination of precision and something that might, in a softer man, have been called care. She opened her mouth to respond, but found she had nothing to say that would not betray more than she intended. So she said nothing. The Duke, perhaps sensing this, did not press. He simply inclined his head and turned his gaze back to the window. The silence that followed was different from all the others. Not the silence of strangers, or of two people performing politeness. Something had shifted. The first, quiet recognition that they were learning to see each other. When the carriage stopped at Ellsworth House, the Duke handed Rose down. She offered her curtsy, murmured her thanks, and turned toward the door. "Lady Rose." She stopped, turned back. He stood in the lamplight, half in shadow. For a moment he said nothing. He simply looked at her, with that steady, searching attention that had followed her all evening. And then, very slightly, he nodded. It was not a dismissal. It was not politeness. It was something quieter than either, and Rose carried it with her up the stairs and into her room, where she sat for a long time in the dark. He sees me, she thought, not the hostess, not the useful daughter. Me. It was, perhaps, the most dangerous thing anyone had ever done to her, and it was the most wonderful thing she had ever felt. Parte 2. The days that followed settled into something Rose had not expected. Rhythm. Each morning, a letter arrived from Whitmore, sealed with the Calderwyn crest, precise as a military dispatch. The guest list for the next event. Notes on who mattered, who was to be avoided, what topics might arise, and how to steer them. Rose read each one at her small writing desk and absorbed the information with the thoroughness she brought to everything. But it was not the letters that occupied her thoughts. It was the spaces between them. The Duke did not seek her out between events. He did not send personal notes, did not request conversations. Their interactions remained confined to the carriage rides and the evenings themselves, and yet, within those boundaries, something had begun to shift. A quality of attention that Rose could not quite name, but could not ignore. The way his gaze found her in a crowded room without appearing to search. The way he positioned himself, almost imperceptibly, so that she was never left unprotected in conversation. The way, at the end of each evening, he handed her into the carriage with a care that went slightly beyond what duty required. Rose noticed these things the way one notices the turning of seasons, not in any single moment, but in the accumulation of small changes that, taken together, altered the landscape entirely. She did not allow herself to read meaning into them. Not yet. She had spent too many years learning that attention was not the same as regard, and regard was not the same as being chosen. The Duke was simply observing, cataloguing. He was a man of discipline and precision, and she was a new element in his carefully ordered world. Of course he would study her. It did not mean anything more than that, or so she told herself on the mornings when she caught herself wondering what he had thought of her the night before. The invitation came not through Whitmore, but from the Duke himself. Rose was in the library at Calderwyn House, reviewing notes for that evening's dinner, when the door opened and Robert Montford entered without announcement. She rose, but he raised a hand, a slight, practiced gesture that stopped her mid-movement. "Don't. We are not at a formal event." He stood by the fireplace, hands behind his back. His habitual posture, Rose had noticed, the one that kept his body still. "Tomorrow afternoon, a walk in Hyde Park. It would be beneficial for us to be seen together outside of evening events. If we wish the arrangement to appear natural, we must allow it to be observed in daylight as well." "Of course, Your Grace. What time shall I expect the carriage?" 2:00. He paused, then, "Wear something warm. The wind comes off the Serpentine in the afternoons." He left. Rose sat for a long moment in the quiet library, turning those last words over. Wear something warm. Such an ordinary instruction. And yet no one, not her mother, not her sisters, not a single person in her life had ever thought to say it to her. The next afternoon was bright and cool, the kind of rare April day London offered like a gift. Rose dressed in moss-green silk beneath a cream pelisse and did not examine her choices too closely. The Duke was waiting at the carriage, already composed, watching her approach with that particular stillness she was beginning to recognize as his natural state. In the pale light, he looked less like the fearsome War Duke London whispered about, and more like a man simply enjoying the spring. "Shall we?" he said, offering his arm. Rose took it. The sensation of his arm beneath her hand, solid, warm through the layers of wool, was different from the brief contacts of their evening encounters. This was sustained, a point of connection that would last for the duration of their walk, and Rose was acutely aware of it as they moved through the gates of Hyde Park. The Serpentine gleamed silver in the afternoon light, and the paths were crowded with the fashionable, the whole glittering machinery of the ton on display. Rose felt the eyes on them immediately, not casual glances, but the sharp attention of people who recognized the Duke and were now revising their understanding of his habits. "They are staring," Rose observed. "They always stare," the Duke said. "At me with caution, at you, I suspect, with curiosity." "And what shall I do with their curiosity?" "Exactly what you have been doing. Ignore it with grace." Rose smiled, a real smile, not the performed one she wore at events, and felt something loosen in her chest. Walking beside him in the open air, with sunlight and breeze around them, was different from the hothouse atmosphere of drawing rooms, more honest, as though the daylight stripped away a layer of pretense the candlelit evenings required. They walked along the edge of the Serpentine, the water reflecting the pale sky, and Rose felt for the first time since the arrangement had begun, something approaching peace. "You are not what I expected," the Duke said. Rose glanced at him. His expression was thoughtful, the look of a man turning something over, examining it from different angles. "And what did you expect, Your Grace? Someone more anxious to please, someone who would try to charm me or impress me, or make herself indispensable through effort." He paused. "You do none of those things. Would you prefer that I did?" "No." The word was immediate, and something in its firmness surprised even him, a flicker of self-awareness before he smoothed it away. "It is refreshing, to be in the company of someone who does not perform." "Everyone performs, Your Grace," Rose said quietly. "I have simply had more practice at making the performance invisible." He turned his head, and his eyes met hers with an intensity that made the air between them feel suddenly charged, as though the ordinary afternoon had become something else entirely, something that required more care than either of them had yet given it. "Yes," he said after a long moment. "I can see that." Near the end of their walk, the Duke slowed his pace. They stood for a moment in the dappled shade of an elm, the sounds of the park muffled around them. "Thank you," he said, and then, as though the words surprised him, "for today, it was pleasant." Rose heard beneath the plainness of it something that sounded very much like gratitude, genuine, offered by a man who did not offer it easily. "It was pleasant for me as well, Your Grace," she said, and meant it. 3 evenings later, after a dinner at the home of Lord and Lady Ashworth that had run long and ended with a political argument Rose had spent 40 minutes carefully diffusing, the Duke broke the silence in the carriage for the second time. "How do you do it?" he asked. Rose, who had been watching the lamplight move across the buildings of Pall Mall, turned to find him studying her with an expression she had not seen before, something between bewilderment and genuine curiosity. "Do what, Your Grace?" "Manage them. The conversations, the conflicts. You saw what was happening between Ashworth and Devereux. They were seconds away from saying something that could not be taken back. And you—" He shook his head, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "You redirected them, without either of them noticing, without drawing any attention to yourself. How?" Rose considered the question. It was not one she had ever been asked before, not because no one had noticed what she did, but because the people who benefited from it had never thought to wonder how it was accomplished. It simply happened, like the weather or the turning of the seasons, and no one questioned the mechanism. "I listen," she said at last. "Most people, when they are angry or frightened, want to be heard. They do not want to be corrected or contradicted. They want someone to acknowledge what they are feeling. So I do that, quietly, without making a spectacle of it, and once they feel heard, they are usually willing to be guided somewhere else." The Duke was silent for a long moment. The carriage rocked gently over a rough patch of road, and the lamplight flickered across his face. Light, shadow, light again. "You have spent a great deal of time listening to people who do not listen to you," he said. It was not a question, and it was so precisely, so uncomfortably accurate, that Rose felt something tighten in her chest, not pain exactly, but the sensation of being seen in a place she had kept carefully hidden. "It is what I do, Your Grace," she said, and kept her voice steady. He did not press her. But his gaze remained on her face for several seconds longer than was comfortable, and when he finally looked away, something in the set of his jaw had changed, tightened perhaps, or resolved, as though he had come to a conclusion about something and did not yet know what to do with it. The morning after the Ashworth dinner, Rose woke to find a small package on the hall table at Ellsworth House, wrapped in plain brown paper, bearing no card, no seal, no indication of the sender. Inside was a single stem of lily of the valley, pressed between two sheets of parchment, and beneath it a note in handwriting she recognized immediately. The writing was precise, angular, unmistakably the Duke's, but the words were not the kind she had expected from him. Not formal, not businesslike, simply, "These bloom in April. They are said to mean return of happiness. I thought you might appreciate the sentiment, even if the science behind it is entirely invented." Rose read the note twice. Then she sat down on the hall bench and held the pressed flower in her palm, and felt something crack open inside her chest that she had not known was closed. It was such a small thing. A single flower. A few lines of dry, self-deprecating humor. No declaration, no grand gesture, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had been thinking of her, that he had seen something in her, a capacity for joy perhaps, or a hunger for it, and had responded to it privately, without expectation of anything in return. Rose tucked the note into the pocket of her morning dress and carried it with her for the rest of the day, pressing her fingers against it occasionally, as though reassuring herself that it was real. She did not mention it to anyone. By the middle of May, London had made up its mind. The Duke of Calderwin and Lady Rose Ellsworth were seen together at no fewer than 11 public events over the course of 3 weeks, at dinners, at receptions, at the opera, and most notably at their afternoon walk in Hyde Park, which had been witnessed by no fewer than a dozen members of the ton, and reported with breathless enthusiasm by Mrs. Hartwell, Lady Pemberton, and at least 2 columnists in the morning papers. The whispers took on a life of their own. Some said the arrangement was purely practical, a convenient hostess for a duke who found society tiresome. Others, more romantically inclined, suggested that something deeper was at work. Rose heard the rumors through Eleanor, who burst into her sitting room one morning with the kind of gleeful energy that only fresh gossip could produce. "They are saying he chose you," Eleanor said, dropping into a chair without ceremony. "Not hired you, chose you. There is a difference, apparently, and Mrs. Hartwell is very clear about it." Rose looked up from her book. "Mrs. Hartwell is very clear about most things, whether or not she has any basis for clarity." "But is it true?" Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes bright. "Is there something between you? Because you have not told me anything, Rose. You come home every evening and you say nothing, and meanwhile all of London is—" "All of London can speculate as it wishes," Rose said, with a calm that surprised even her. "The arrangement is what it is." Eleanor studied her sister's face for a long moment, searching perhaps for the crack in the composure that would reveal the truth. But Rose had spent a lifetime perfecting that composure, and it held now, as it always did, like armor that had become so familiar, she sometimes forgot she was wearing it. Eleanor left, unsatisfied, and Rose sat alone in her sitting room, the pressed lily of the valley tucked between the pages of her book, and wondered how much longer she could maintain the fiction that this was simply an arrangement. If this story has moved you, if you have felt even a fraction of what Rose feels standing in the lamplight with a man who is only beginning to see her, then I would be honored to have you join this community. Please subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, and it means everything to the people who create these stories for you. And while you are here, tell me something. In the comments below, Share a moment. A small, quiet moment when someone saw you, truly saw you, for the first time. Just a moment when you felt for the first time that you were not invisible. Now let us return to Rose, because the season is not finished, and neither, it seems, is the Duke. Almack's Assembly Rooms on King Street was the citadel of the Ton, the one venue where inclusion was essential and exclusion was, for all practical purposes, social death. The weekly Wednesday assemblies were less dances than auditions, presided over by patronesses who wielded their power with ruthless efficiency. Rose had been inside Almack's only once before, years ago, brought by her mother to observe from the edges. She remembered it as impossibly bright, the faces of the patronesses as still and appraising as portraits. Tonight she entered on the Duke's arm, and the experience was entirely different. The room shifted for them, not dramatically, but with the subtle, instinctive recalibration that occurred whenever the Duke of Calderwin entered a space. Conversations dipped, heads turned. Rose kept her expression pleasant and focused on the task at hand, managing the evening, protecting the Duke from the more aggressive socializers, ensuring the arrangement appeared natural and unremarkable. They had been there less than an hour when Lady Beatrice Ashcombe appeared. Rose noticed her across the room, a flash of gold silk, a smile too bright and too controlled to be genuine, and felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear, the recognition of an adversary who had already begun to move. Beatrice waited until Rose was alone, separated from the Duke by a conversation with Lady Devonshire, and then she struck. "Lady Rose." Beatrice materialized at her elbow with the ease of someone who had been watching for precisely this moment. Her smile was radiant, her tone light, and her eyes utterly calculating. "How wonderful to see you here. You are looking quite presentable this evening." The word landed exactly where it was intended, just below the surface, impossible to call out without drawing attention. "Lady Beatrice," Rose said, "you are looking lovely, as always." "You are too kind." Beatrice leaned in, lowering her voice to the intimate register that suggested confidence between friends, though there was nothing friendly in her expression. "I could not help but notice how attentive the Duke has been this evening, quite unlike his usual manner. One might almost think he had developed an interest." Rose kept her smile fixed. "The Duke is simply fulfilling his social obligations, Lady Beatrice, as am I." "Of course, of course." Beatrice's smile widened, a fraction too much, revealing something sharp beneath. "Though I confess I find it curious. The Duke has never before shown any inclination toward companionship. One wonders what has changed." Her gaze swept over Rose with a deliberateness meant to diminish. "Or perhaps it is simply that he has found someone quiet enough not to challenge him. Men like that, wounded men, broken men, they do prefer women who will not ask difficult questions." The words were delivered with perfect sweetness, and every one of them was a blade. Rose held Beatrice's gaze for a long, steady moment. She did not flinch. She simply stood in Almack's glittering crowd and absorbed the blow with the composure she had spent a lifetime perfecting. "I am sure you are right, Lady Beatrice," she said at last, perfectly even. "Men are curious creatures, they so rarely behave as we expect them to." Something flickered in Beatrice's expression, frustration at having failed to provoke a reaction, but she recovered quickly, offered a smile that was all teeth, and drifted away into the crowd. Rose exhaled. Slowly, in a way no one watching would have noticed. She had not broken. But the effort of not breaking had cost her more than she wanted to admit. It was not Almack's, but a dinner party, 3 nights later, at the home of Lord and Lady Ashworth, that the evening changed. The garden behind their townhouse was small but well kept. Terraced levels, climbing roses just beginning to bloom, lanterns strung along the pathways. Rose had come outside to escape a conversation about the corn laws. She stood near the top of the steps, champagne in hand, and allowed herself a quiet breath. "The corn laws," said a voice behind her, "are not, I think, as fascinating as Lord Devereux believes them to be." Rose turned. The Duke stood at the top of the steps, his expression carrying something that might have been amusement. "They are not," Rose agreed. though I suspect Lord Devereux would disagree. Lord Devereux would disagree with the sunrise if given the opportunity. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. You escaped. It seemed preferable to falling asleep standing up. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. Rose watched it come and go, and felt something warm and complicated settle in her chest. "Walk with me," the Duke said. Rose set down her champagne glass and took his arm. They descended the garden steps together, slowly, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. The Duke's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. Not deliberately, Rose thought at first, but simply the natural consequence of the narrow path and the darkness. But then his fingers shifted, settling over hers with a warmth and pressure that felt less accidental and more intentional than anything that had come before. Rose did not move her hand. She simply walked beside him, feeling the warmth of his hand over hers, and let the moment exist without naming it. They reached the bench beneath the pergola. The ivy rustled overhead, and the lantern light here was dimmer, softer, more private. The rest of the garden stretched above them, the other guests visible only as distant silhouettes against the golden windows of the house. Rose sat. The Duke sat beside her, close enough that the warmth of him was a presence on her skin. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was the silence of two people who had moved past the need to fill every pause with words. "I owe you an apology," the Duke said. Rose turned her head. In the dim light, his face was very close, close enough that she could see the shadows beneath his eyes, the fine lines at their corners that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and smoke. "For what, Your Grace?" "For the terms of this arrangement." Something in his voice had changed, stripped of its usual authority, replaced by something quieter. "You were placed in this position without your true consent. I understood that from the beginning, and I did not—" He stopped, began again. "I told myself it was practical, convenient, but that is not the whole truth, and I find I am unwilling to continue pretending otherwise." Rose was very still. She felt the weight of his words, not just what he was saying, but what it cost him to say it. This was not a man who apologized easily. "What is the whole truth, Your Grace?" she asked very quietly. He turned his head, and his eyes met hers in the lamplight, dark, searching, and more open than she had ever seen them. "That I have enjoyed your company," he said, "far more than I expected to, and that the enjoyment has become inconvenient." Rose understood, with a clarity that felt like stepping into cold water, exactly what he meant. This was not a confession of affection. This was a man confessing to the existence of a feeling he had not asked for, did not know how to manage, and found deeply, fundamentally unsettling. She could have deflected, offered some light, diplomatic response that would have allowed them both to retreat to safer ground. Instead, she chose honesty. "I have enjoyed it as well," she said, and held his gaze, steady and calm, and let the words stand. The silence that followed was charged, the silence of two people standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain, looking at each other across the threshold. Then, from somewhere above them in the garden, a burst of laughter erupted, loud, sudden, shattering the quiet like a stone through glass. Rose startled, and the moment broke. The Duke's expression shuttered immediately, the mask sliding back with practiced ease, and he rose, offering Rose his hand. She took it, and his grip was firm and businesslike, and the warmth of the moment retreated like a tide going out. "We should return to the party," he said. His voice was steady, but Rose caught the faintest tremor beneath it, so slight it might have been her imagination. They walked back up the garden steps in silence, and Rose carried the weight of his words. The enjoyment has become inconvenient, like a stone in her pocket, turning it over and over, feeling its edges. It happened at Lady Harrington's musicale, on a warm evening in late May, when the windows had been thrown open to let in the night air and the drawing room smelled of jasmine and candle wax. The performance had been unremarkable, a soprano of moderate talent, followed by the usual milling about. Rose had managed the evening with her usual efficiency, and the Duke had been at her side throughout. his attention steady and quiet, his hand occasionally finding the small of her back in the way that had become, without either of them naming it, a signal between them. It was near the end of the evening when they found themselves alone. Not truly alone. They were in a drawing room full of people, but alone in the way that mattered, separated from the crowd by a half-open door that led onto a small balcony overlooking the street. Rose had stepped out for air, and the Duke had followed, and now they stood side by side in the warm darkness, the sounds of the musical muffled behind them. The balcony was narrow. They stood close, closer than propriety strictly allowed, though the darkness and the half-open door provided privacy. Rose rested her hands on the stone balustrade and looked out at London's rooftops, silver-grey in the moonlight, and felt the familiar warmth of the Duke's presence beside her, solid, steady, a point of gravity. Rose. Her name. Not Lady Rose, not Lady Ellsworth. Just Rose, spoken in a voice so low it barely carried above the night air, and with a quality of care that made something inside her chest go very, very still. She turned her head. He was looking at her. Not with the quiet observation she had grown accustomed to, something else entirely, something raw and unguarded, and slightly afraid. The expression of a man who had spent years behind walls and had just discovered that one of them had crumbled without his permission. "Robert," she said, and did not know until the word left her lips that she had been wanting to say it. The space between them contracted. Rose was not sure which of them moved. Perhaps both, drawn together by some force that had been building for weeks, invisible and inexorable. His hand lifted, and his fingers touched her face. Just the tips, barely there, tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness so careful it made her breath catch. She leaned into the touch, could not help it, had not wanted to. His other hand found hers on the balustrade, and their fingers interlaced, slowly, deliberately, as though both were aware of the significance and wanted to feel every moment of it. Rose looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the distance between them was nothing. A breath, a heartbeat, the width of a single choice. He bent his head. Rose's eyes closed. She felt the warmth of him, the closeness, the faint brush of his breath against her lips. Well, well. The voice cut through the moment like a blade through silk. Rose's eyes flew open. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, her expression a masterful composition of surprise, delight, and triumph. She wore gold, a gown that caught the lamplight and threw it back in sharp flashes, and her smile was the most dangerous thing Rose had ever seen. "Oh, do forgive me," Beatrice said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "I had no idea anyone was out here. How terribly intimate." Her gaze moved from Rose to the Duke and back again, cataloguing everything. The proximity, the interlaced fingers, the flush on Rose's cheeks that no amount of composure could conceal. "I do hope I have not interrupted anything important." The Duke released Rose's hand. The movement was controlled, but Rose felt the loss of it like a physical blow. He straightened, and his expression shuttered, the mask sliding back into place. "Lady Ashcombe," he said, perfectly level. "I believe Lady Harrington was looking for you." Beatrice's smile widened. She held the Duke's gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, a small, deliberate assertion, and then turned to Rose. The look she gave her was laden with meaning, a promise delivered without words that what she had witnessed would not remain private for long. "It was lovely to see you, Lady Rose," Beatrice said, and swept back into the drawing room. Rose did not look at the Duke. She stared at the street below, at the lamplit cobblestones, and felt the warmth of the almost kiss fade from her lips, like something she had only imagined. "I am sorry," the Duke said, after a long moment. His voice was quiet, controlled. But beneath the control, Rose heard frustration, not at Beatrice but at himself, at the impossibility of wanting something and not being able to take it without consequence. "There is nothing to apologize for, Your Grace," Rose said, and meant it, and did not mean it all at once. They returned to the party, They managed the remainder of the evening, and when the carriage ride home passed in silence, heavier and more complicated than any before, Rose did not try to break it. She sat in the darkness, feeling the ghost of his fingers on her face, and wondered how much longer either of them could pretend this was only an arrangement. Rose did not sleep. She lay in her bed at Ellsworth House, watching the shadows move across the ceiling as the night deepened, and then slowly began to lighten, and turned the events of the evening over and over in her mind like a puzzle she could not solve. Beatrice had seen them. Beatrice, who had been watching from the beginning, who had assessed Rose as a threat the moment she appeared at the Duke's side, and had been, since that first encounter at the Duchess of Devonshire's reception, quietly, systematically working to destroy her. Rose knew how this would unfold. She understood the machinery of the ton with the precision of someone who had been ground between its gears more than once. Beatrice would talk, not immediately, but at the right moment, to the right people. The effect would be devastating. Not because of what had happened on the balcony, nothing, strictly speaking, had happened, but because of what it suggested. An unmarried woman, alone with an unmarried man, in the dark, with no chaperone. The ton did not require proof. It required only possibility. Rose turned onto her side and stared at the pale curtains and felt the weight of it settle onto her chest like a stone. She could withdraw from the arrangement, step back, disappear into the quiet anonymity she had occupied for most of her life, and let the whispers die of their own accord. It would be the safe choice, the sensible choice, the choice that protected her reputation and her family's name, and cost her nothing but the thing she had only just begun to want. Or she could stay. She could face Beatrice and the ton, and whatever came next, and see it through to the end. Rose lay in the grey pre-dawn light and considered both options, and found to her own surprise that the choice was not difficult at all. She was not going to disappear. Not again. Not for anyone. The morning came, pale and quiet, and Rose rose from bed, dressed with care, and went down to breakfast. Her mother was already at the table reading the Morning Post. Eleanor was not yet awake. The house was still and peaceful, and Rose ate her toast and drank her tea and said nothing, and felt beneath the quiet composure she wore like skin, something that had not been there before. Not courage exactly. Something quieter than that. A decision, made in the small hours of the night, that she would not be moved from this position by fear. That whatever Beatrice did, whatever the ton said, whatever happened next, Rose Ellsworth would not shrink. She had spent too many years being useful. It was time at last to be seen. Rose did not see the Duke for 4 days after Lady Harrington's musicale. She did not seek him out. She did not write to Whitmore asking about the next event. She simply waited in the quiet of her sitting room at Ellsworth House and tried to sort through the wreckage of what had happened on that balcony with the same calm, methodical attention she brought to everything else. It did not work. The ghost of his fingers on her jaw refused to stay where she had put it. The memory of his breath against her lips, the way the world had narrowed to a single point of warmth before Beatrice shattered it. These things followed Rose through her days like shadows, impossible to dismiss. She tried to be rational. The arrangement was precisely that, an arrangement, a seasonal convenience, a role that would end when the season ended, leaving her exactly where she had begun. Except that was no longer true, and she knew it. Something had shifted in her, not gradually but all at once, like a lock turning. The Duke had seen her, not the useful daughter, not the quiet hostess. He had seen Rose, and Rose had seen him, the man beneath the armor, the warmth beneath the discipline, the hunger he had spent years trying to silence. And now Beatrice knew. Rose sat in her sitting room on the 4th morning, a book open in her lap that she had not turned a page of in an hour, and stared at the window and thought, "This is going to end badly. I have always known how these things end. And yet I walked into it anyway, and I cannot bring myself to regret it, and that perhaps is the most dangerous thing of all." The letter from Whitmore arrived that afternoon. Brief, businesslike. The Duke would be attending a reception at Lady Hartley's on Saturday evening. Rose's presence was requested. She wrote back a single line. "I will be there." By Thursday, the damage had started. Rose learned of it not from any single source, but from the accumulation of small telling signs. The way conversations paused when she entered a room, the way eyes followed her with a new, curious intensity, the way Lady Pemberton's smile, when Rose encountered her at a milliner's on Bond Street, carried something uncomfortable beneath its warmth. "My dear," Lady Pemberton said, adjusting a ribbon on a hat she had no intention of buying, "I do hope you are being careful. There are people talking, you know, about you and the Duke, about what was seen at Lady Harrington's." Rose kept her expression perfectly neutral. "People always talk, Lady Pemberton. It is what they do best." Of course, of course." Lady Pemberton lowered her voice, and something in her tone shifted, from social pleasantry to something that sounded almost like genuine concern. "But this is different. The source is rather well positioned, you understand. Lady Ashcombe has been very active, shall we say, and she has friends." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Rose nodded, thanked Lady Pemberton for her concern, and left the shop with the same measured grace she always maintained in public. It was only in the privacy of the carriage, alone with the curtains drawn, that she allowed her hands to tremble. Beatrice had moved quickly, more quickly than Rose had anticipated, though in retrospect she should not have been surprised. Beatrice was not a woman who waited when action would serve her better. She had seen what she needed to see on that balcony, and she had begun immediately to use it. The whispers spread through the ton the way rumors always did, not as accusations exactly, but as questions. Gentle, innocent questions, posed in drawing rooms and over afternoon tea, that carried their own damning implications. Had Lady Rose been seen alone with the Duke? At night, without a chaperone? How very unusual. How very interesting. The questions did not need answers. They needed only to be asked, and they were being asked everywhere by people who had no reason to defend Rose and every reason to enjoy watching her fall. Rose spent the remainder of Thursday and all of Friday in her sitting room, reading and writing letters, and doing nothing that could be observed or remarked upon. She did not tell her mother what was happening. She did not tell Eleanor. She did not tell anyone. She was not yet ready to be rescued, not by anyone other than herself. Saturday morning brought rain, a hard grey downpour that streaked the windows of Ellsworth House and turned Kensington streets into rivers of mud. Rose was at breakfast when her mother appeared in the doorway, still in her dressing gown, which was unusual enough to signal something serious. The Viscountess sat down across from Rose without preamble, and regarded her youngest daughter with an expression that Rose had seen only rarely. Not anger, not disappointment, but something colder. Calculation. "I have had a visit from Lady Ashcombe's mother," the Viscountess said. Rose set down her teacup. "I see." She was concerned about certain rumours circulating regarding your conduct at Lady Harrington's musicale. The Viscountess's voice was perfectly level, but something moved beneath it. A current of controlled fury that Rose recognized as fear, dressed in the language of propriety. She suggested, in the strongest possible terms, that we might wish to reconsider the arrangement with the Duke. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her nothing because I had nothing to tell her." The Viscountess's gaze sharpened. "Which is why I am asking you, Rose, what happened at Lady Harrington's?" The question hung between them, direct, unavoidable, the first time her mother had ever asked Rose anything with genuine urgency. Rose looked at the woman across the table, at the careful composure, the fear beneath it, the love that had always been there but had never quite learned how to express itself without the armor of social strategy, and felt for the first time something other than resentment. "Nothing happened, Mother," Rose said, quietly, steadily. "Lady Ashcombe saw something she chose to interpret as she wished. That is all." The Viscountess studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, sharply, and stood. "Be careful, Rose," she said, and left the room without another word. It was, Rose reflected, the closest her mother had ever come to saying, "I am afraid for you." The news reached Robert Montford on Friday evening, delivered by Whitmore, who appeared in the library with an expression of barely concealed alarm. "Your Grace, Lady Ashcombe has been distributing certain information among the Tunny regarding Lady Rose, regarding what was witnessed at Lady Harrington's musical." Robert listened in silence as Whitmore outlined the whispers, the questions, the systematic campaign Beatrice had been conducting over the past 48 hours. When Whitmore finished, the silence in the library was absolute. Something shifted in Robert's eyes, something cold and precise. "Who else knows?" "The usual channels, Your Grace. Lady Pemberton, Lady Hartley, several of the patronesses at Almack's." "And Lady Rose?" "I have not contacted her. I thought it best to inform you first." Robert nodded. He stared into the fire for a long moment, long enough for Whitmore to understand that the matter was being weighed with the same gravity his employer once brought to military decisions. "Cancel nothing," Robert said at last. His voice was very quiet, very calm. "Saturday evening proceeds as planned. Lady Rose will be there. Your Grace, given the circumstances, Saturday evening proceeds as planned." He turned and his gaze met Whitmore's with an intensity that brooked no argument. "And ensure that every patroness of Almack's receives an invitation to Lady Hartley's reception. Everyone." Whitmore bowed and left. Robert stood alone in the firelight and felt something that was not discipline or duty but fury, clean, bright and absolute, not at Beatrice, at himself. For the years he had spent believing that wanting something was a weakness he could not afford, for the cowardice of it, and for the fact that Rose was paying the price. He sat at his desk and wrote a plan. Precise, military in its clarity, because tomorrow night he was going to end this, all of it. The pretense, the distance, the careful management of everything he felt. Tomorrow night he was going to choose. The rain had cleared by Saturday evening, leaving London washed and golden. Rose dressed with particular care, a gown of deep ivory silk, simple in cut but exquisite in fabric, with a single strand of pearls at her throat. She looked in the mirror exactly as she intended, composed, dignified, and utterly unafraid. The composure was not entirely genuine, but it was close enough that no one would tell the difference, and that was precisely the point. The Duke was already in the carriage when it collected her. The silence between them as they moved through the lamplit streets was heavy, full of things neither had yet said. Rose did not attempt to break it. "You know," she said at last. "I know," the Duke said. Another silence. Then Rose turned her head and found him watching her, not with quiet observation but with something open and raw and slightly desperate. "Whatever happens tonight," Rose said very quietly, "I want you to know that I do not regret any of it. The arrangement, the walks, the evenings." She paused. "Any of it." Something moved in his expression, a crack in the composure, there and gone. He nodded once and did not look away. They did not speak again until they arrived. Lady Hartley's reception was large enough to matter, intimate enough to be dangerous. The rooms were crowded, the champagne flowing, and Rose felt the shift in atmosphere the moment they entered, not the usual recalibration that accompanied the Duke's arrival, but something sharper. Heads turned. Whispers rippled outward. Rose kept her expression pleasant and walked beside the Duke as though the eyes on them meant nothing at all. They had been there less than 30 minutes when Lady Beatrice Ashcombe made her entrance. She arrived late enough to ensure maximum attention, wearing white, the colour of innocence, her smile radiant and entirely calculated. Rose watched her move through the crowd and felt not fear, but a kind of tired recognition. This was how it ended, the beautiful woman with the sharp smile, finding the crack in Rose's armour. Except tonight, Rose thought, with a steadiness that surprised her, I am not going to let it. Beatrice found her opportunity near the edge of the ballroom, where a group of ladies, including 2 patronesses of Almack's, had gathered. Rose was engaged in conversation with Lady Devonshire when Beatrice materialized at the edge of the group. "Lady Rose," Beatrice's voice carried, not loudly, but clearly enough that nearby conversations quieted. "How brave of you to be here this evening. After everything that has been said, I think it shows remarkable courage. The word was spoken with sweetness that turned it into its opposite. The silence that followed was the particular dangerous silence of a room holding its breath. Rose turned to face Beatrice. She did not smile. She did not flinch. She simply looked at the younger woman with the same steady gaze she had worn throughout their entire acquaintance. "Lady Beatrice," Rose said, "perfectly even. How kind of you to be concerned about my well-being." Beatrice's smile flickered, just for an instant. "Of course I am concerned. We are friends, are we not?" She turned to the group, widening her smile. "I do hope you will all be understanding. Lady Rose has had such a difficult season. The rumors have been so unkind. One cannot help but wonder what the Duke of Calderwin thinks of all this. Attention his hostess has been receiving." The implication was crystal clear. Every person in the room heard it. Rose opened her mouth to respond. She did not need to. "Lady Ashcombe," the voice came from behind Rose, low, controlled, carrying the authority of a man who had spent years commanding rooms far larger and far more dangerous than this one. Every head turned. The Duke of Calderwin stood at Rose's shoulder. He had appeared silently, with the deliberate precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. His expression was perfectly composed, his posture perfectly straight, and his eyes, fixed on Beatrice, were cold enough to freeze the champagne in its glass. Beatrice's smile did not waver, but something changed behind her eyes, a flicker of alarm, quickly suppressed. She had not expected this. "Your Grace," Beatrice said, recovering. "How lovely. I was simply expressing my concern for Lady Rose. Has it?" It was not a question. The Duke's voice was quiet, dangerously so. He did not look at anyone else. His attention was fixed entirely on Beatrice. "Lady Ashcombe," he said, and his voice carried, not raised but pitched with a clarity that silenced the room. "You have spent the better part of this season attempting to destroy the reputation of a woman who has done nothing to you except exist in my company. You have done so with skill, I will grant you that, and with a complete absence of honor." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Beatrice's smile finally, irrevocably, faltered. She began. "I am not finished." The Duke's tone did not change, remained quiet, controlled, almost conversational, but the silence around them intensified. "Lady Rose Ellsworth is not my hostess. She is not my companion. She is not a convenience or an arrangement or a piece on a board to be moved by anyone, least of all by you." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was so steady, so deliberately clear, that every person in the room heard it without effort. "She is the woman I intend to marry, and I will not stand by while you or anyone else attempts to make her believe otherwise." The silence that followed was absolute. Rose felt the words land like a physical force, a wave so powerful that for a single breathless moment she could not move, could not think, could not do anything except stand perfectly still and feel the world rearrange itself around her. The Duke did not look at her. Not yet. His gaze remained fixed on Beatrice, and in it was something that was not anger, but something harder, the expression of a man who had drawn a line and dared the world to cross it. Beatrice stared back at him for a long, terrible moment. Then very slowly she lifted her chin. Her smile was gone. In its place was an expression Rose had not seen on her before. Not triumph, not calculation, but something quieter. Something that looked almost like defeat. "Well," Beatrice said after a silence that seemed to last an age, "how unexpected." She turned and walked away into the crowd, and the circle of onlookers parted for her without a word, and Lady Beatrice Ashcombe disappeared into the golden light like something dissolving in water. And Rose stood beside the Duke in the sudden, ringing quiet and felt for the first time in her life as though the ground beneath her feet was solid. They did not stay at the reception. Rose was not entirely sure how the departure happened. Only that one moment she was in the ballroom, surrounded by stunned silence, and the next she was in the Duke's carriage, the door shut, the sounds of the party fading. The Duke sat across from her. In the lamplight, his face was very still, the stillness of someone who had just done something irrevocable, and was only now beginning to understand the full weight of it. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The carriage moved through the streets, and London passed outside the windows in its usual haze of gas lamps and shadows, and Rose sat with her hands in her lap and tried to find words for what she was feeling, the shock of it, the warmth of it, the way the world had shifted so completely that she could not yet find her footing in the new landscape. "You did not have to do that," she said at last. The Duke looked at her. Something moved in his expression, not surprise, but something close to it. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, that she was the first person to say this, to acknowledge not the grandeur of the gesture, but the choice behind it, the cost of it. "No," he said, "I did not. The Tun will talk. About what you said. About what it means. I am aware. Your reputation—" "Rose." He said her name the way he had said it on the balcony, quietly, with a care that made it sound like something precious being held in open hands. "I have spent 15 years protecting my reputation. It has kept me safe, and it has kept me alone, and I find that I no longer wish to be either." The words hung between them in the warm darkness of the carriage, and Rose felt something crack open inside her chest, not painfully, but with the particular relief of something that had been held too tightly for too long, finally being released. "Where are we going?" she asked after a moment. "Thornfield Park," the Duke said. "In Sussex. It is my country estate. I think—" He paused, and for the first time Rose heard something in his voice that sounded like uncertainty, the unfamiliar territory of a man who had spent decades certain of everything, and was now, suddenly, unsure. "I think we have a great deal to discuss, away from London, away from the Tun, away from anyone who might be watching." Rose looked at him, at the careful composure, at the uncertainty beneath it, at the man who had stood in front of a room full of the most powerful people in England and chosen her publicly and irrevocably, without condition or qualification. "Yes," she said, "I think we do." The journey to Sussex took most of the night. Rose had sent word to Ellsworth House, a brief note to her mother, explaining only that she had been invited to stay at Thornfield Park and would return within the week. Propriety was a tool she was learning, useful when it served her, worth setting aside when it did not. They arrived in the grey hours before dawn, the countryside still wrapped in early morning quiet. The estate revealed itself gradually as the carriage moved up the drive, gates of wrought iron and ancient oak, an avenue of lime trees, and finally the house itself. It was not what Rose had expected. She had anticipated something severe, another Calderwyn house, all dark stone and military precision. Instead, Thornfield Park was warm. The house was built of honey-coloured stone, with tall windows that caught the pale light and held it, and climbing ivy that softened the edges of the oldest walls. It looked, Rose thought, like a place where someone might actually live, might sit in the garden on a summer afternoon, or read by a fire on a winter evening, or simply exist without the constant performance that London demanded. The Duke watched her face as they approached, and something in his expression shifted, a quiet vulnerability, there and gone, as though the house itself was a confession he had not quite meant to make. "It was my mother's," he said, when she did not speak. "Before the war. I have not been here in some time." Rose understood what he meant, and what it cost him to bring her here, to this place that belonged not to the Duke of Calderwyn, the War Duke, the man London feared and respected at a distance, but to Robert Montford, the man he had been before the war took everything from him and left only discipline in its place. "It is beautiful," she said, and meant it. They were shown to separate rooms. Rose to a guest chamber on the second floor, furnished simply but comfortably, with a view of the gardens and a fire already burning in the grate. She washed, changed into a simpler dress that had been packed for her by Calderwyn House's efficient staff, and sat by the window watching the dawnlight move across the gardens below. The house was quiet. Not the oppressive quiet of Calderwyn House in London, but a living quiet. the kind that came from space and air, and the absence of noise rather than the forcible suppression of it. Birds sang outside the window. Somewhere below, she could hear the faint sound of water, a stream perhaps running through the gardens. Rose sat and listened, and felt the tension she had been carrying for weeks begin, very slowly, to ease. They dined alone that evening, a simple meal in a small dining room overlooking the gardens. The formality of their London interactions fell away almost immediately. Rose wore a plain grey dress with her hair down, and the Duke wore no cravat, his collar open, his sleeves pushed back in a way she had never seen him. Relaxed almost, though not entirely. The habit of vigilance ran too deep for that. They talked through dinner and into the evening, moving to the library afterward, where a fire burned and the shelves were lined with poetry and novels, books that belonged to a different version of the man who sat across from Rose. It was here that Robert Montfort finally told her the truth. Not all of it, but enough. Enough for Rose to understand the shape of what the war had done to him, and the years afterward, and the long process by which a man capable of tenderness had taught himself to believe it was something he could not afford. "I was 20 when I first saw men die," he said, looking at the fire, not at her, his voice carrying the flatness of someone recounting facts they had long since stopped feeling. "At Salamanca, I watched a boy younger than me take a cannonball through his chest and die in the space of a heartbeat, and I thought, if I feel this, I will not survive it. So I stopped feeling it." The fire crackled. It worked. For years it worked. Discipline kept me alive, it kept my men alive, it built a reputation that protected me. He turned his head, and his eyes met hers, more open than she had ever seen them. But it also kept me from everything else, from warmth, from wanting anything beyond the next duty. "And now?" Rose asked very quietly. Robert looked at her for a long moment. The firelight softened the sharp planes of his face, and Rose saw, without any barrier between them, the man he was. Not the War Duke, simply Robert. Tired and wounded, and trying with all the courage he had left to reach across the distance he had spent years creating. "Now," he said, "I find that I no longer wish to set it aside." The words settled between them like something being laid down after a long journey, carefully, with the full awareness of what they meant. Rose watched the flames and felt the weight of what he had given her. Not just his words, but the vulnerability behind them, the trust. "Thank you," she said at last, "for telling me." He nodded, and they sat together in the firelight, and the silence between them was the warmest thing Rose had ever felt. The morning after their conversation in the library, Rose woke to find the gardens drenched in sunlight, a rare, brilliant morning that turned the grounds to gold. She dressed simply and went downstairs to find breakfast already laid, the windows thrown open to the spring air. The Duke was already there, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted, a softening barely perceptible that Rose would have missed if she had not spent weeks learning to read the things he did not say. They ate in comfortable silence, the easy, unhurried quiet of two people who had moved past the need to perform for each other. It was after breakfast, walking together in the gardens, that the conversation turned to what came next. They moved along a stone path that wound past a small fountain, the water catching the light. The air was warm, carrying the green smell of spring, and Rose walked beside the Duke with her arm through his, and felt the solid warmth of him and thought, This is what I want. Not the arrangement, not the season, not the performance. This. "I meant what I said," the Duke said. They had reached a bench at the edge of the garden, a stone seat beneath an old wisteria, its purple blossoms just beginning to open, and he had stopped walking, turning to face her, with an expression of such careful, deliberate intention that Rose felt her breath catch. "At Lady Hartley's, what I said, about marriage, I did not say it as a stratagem, or to silence Lady Ashcombe, or to protect your reputation." He paused, and something flickered in his eyes, vulnerability, raw and unguarded. I said it because it is true. Because I want it to be true. Because I have spent the last weeks discovering that I am capable of wanting something I cannot control, and that the wanting does not frighten me as much as I thought it would. Rose looked at him. At the man who had stood before a room full of London's most powerful people and chosen her without hesitation, and who now, in the quiet of his own garden, was asking her to choose him back. "Robert," she said, and the name felt like something she had always known how to say. "I am not a man who finds emotion easy," he said. "I will not always say the right thing or find the words when they matter most. I have spent too many years behind walls for that, but I can tell you this." He took her hand, both hands holding them in his own with a firmness that was also a question. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to make you feel what you made me feel. The night I watched you walk through Lady Pemberton's ballroom and saw, for the first time in years, someone who was not afraid to be exactly who she was." Rose's breath caught. She looked down at their joined hands, his large and warm, hers steady between them, and felt something shift inside her that was not surprise or shock or joy exactly, something quieter. The end of a very long journey, and the beginning of something she had not dared to imagine. "Yes," she said. The word was simple. It did not need embellishment or the careful diplomatic language she had spent a lifetime perfecting. It simply was, an answer given freely by a woman who had spent too many years being useful and was finally, at last, choosing to be wanted. Robert's hands tightened around hers. Then he lifted one hand, slowly, with the same deliberate care he brought to everything, and touched her face. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, the way they had on the balcony at Lady Harrington's, and this time there was no one to interrupt them. Rose looked up at him. He looked down at her, and the last, careful inch between them closed. His lips met hers. It was not the desperate, breathless kiss of the almost on the balcony. It was something different, quieter, slower, more deliberate. A kiss that said, "I have thought about this, I have wanted this, and I am not afraid anymore." Rose felt his hand curve around the back of her neck, gentle and warm, and she leaned into him, and the kiss deepened, not urgently, but with the tenderness of two people who had waited a very long time and found, in the waiting, something worth the patience. When they drew apart, the wisteria blooms trembled in a breeze, and the garden was very quiet, and Rose was smiling, a real smile, unguarded and unperformed, the kind she had not worn in years. "I should warn you," Robert said, and something in his voice had changed, warmer, lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. "I intend to be very persistent about this." Rose laughed, bright and genuine, filling the garden like birdsong. "I would not have it any other way," she said. They spent 3 days at Thornfield Park. It was not entirely proper. Rose knew this, and the knowledge sat at the back of her mind like a stone she chose not to examine too closely. But propriety was a useful tool only when it served her, and in this case it did not. The days were quiet and warm and unhurried. They walked in the mornings, talked through the afternoons, and spent the evenings in the library by the fire. Robert told her about his work with veterans, the project he had been funding quietly for years, providing homes and employment for men who had returned from the war broken and forgotten. Rose told him about her writing, the letters she had spent years composing for other people, the words she had never allowed herself to put on paper for herself. On the third night, when the house was quiet and the fire had burned low, Rose looked at Robert across the space between their chairs and saw in his eyes the question he had not yet asked aloud. She rose from her chair, crossed the room, and when she reached him, she did not sit beside him. She stood before him and held out her hand and said nothing at all. He took her hand. Rose felt his fingers tighten around hers, and something shift in the silence between them, a deepening, a recognition, a mutual understanding that they were about to cross a boundary from which there would be no return. He rose, drew her close, and when he lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles slowly one by one, Rose felt the tenderness of it like warmth flooding through her, and knew, with a certainty that required no words, that this was not merely desire. It was trust. the culmination of everything that had been building between them since the first night she had walked into Calderwin House and held his gaze without flinching. When he lifted her in his arms and carried her from the library, Rose rested her head against his shoulder and listened to the quiet of Thornfield Park, the creak of old floorboards, the distant sound of the stream, the warmth of him beneath her hands, and felt, for the first time in her life, entirely seen. The morning came soft and grey, mist curling through the gardens. Rose woke slowly, peacefully, with the warmth of sunlight on her face and the warmth of another body beside her. She turned her head on the pillow and found Robert watching her, his dark eyes soft in the early light, his expression carrying something she had never seen on his face before. Peace. "Good morning," he said, very quietly. Rose smiled, that same unguarded smile she had worn in the garden, and reached for his hand. "Good morning," she said. And the morning unfolded around them, golden and unhurried, as though the world itself had decided to slow down. You have just witnessed something rare, a woman who spent her entire life being told she was useful, finally discovering that she was irreplaceable, and a man who had spent years believing that love was something he had forfeited, finding it in the last place he expected, in the quiet, steady gaze of someone who refused to look away. If this story has stayed with you, if Rose's journey has moved something inside you, then please, subscribe to this channel. It is the simplest way to say, I am here. I want more stories like this one. And now I want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell me, what does it mean to you to truly be seen by someone? Not admired, not needed, seen. The way Rose was seen. Share your story, however small, however quiet, because the quietest stories are often the ones that matter most. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and thank you for believing, as I do, that love is always worth the wait. Now let us see how the story ends. They returned to London on a Tuesday morning. The news of what Robert had said at Lady Hartley's had consumed the ton in their absence, and by the time they stepped from the carriage at Calderwin House, the machinery of London society had already begun to process the information, sorting it, categorizing it, deciding what it meant. The first test came that evening, when Rose returned to Ellsworth House to find her mother waiting in the drawing room. The Viscountess rose when Rose entered, a gesture so unusual that Rose stopped in the doorway. Her mother's expression was difficult to read. Not anger, something more complex, shock, calculation, and something that might, in a less guarded woman, have been pride. "I have heard," the Viscountess said simply. "Yes, I imagine you have." A silence. The Viscountess studied her daughter, really studied her, with an attention Rose had rarely received, and something shifted in her expression, a reassessment. "The Duke of Calderwin," the Viscountess said, publicly before half the ton. "Yes, mother." The Viscountess nodded, once sharply, with the decisive air of a woman who had made a calculation and found the result satisfactory. "Well," she said, "I suppose we had better begin planning the engagement announcement." It was not an apology. It was not an admission that Rose had been treated unfairly. It was simply an acknowledgement, practical, entirely in keeping with the Viscountess's nature, that the world had changed, and Rose had changed with it, and the old rules no longer applied. Rose accepted it for what it was, and felt, beneath the acceptance, something that was not quite forgiveness but was close enough to begin with. Eleanor came next, bursting into Rose's room that evening with breathless energy, but with something different in her eyes. Not just excitement, something quieter, wonder. "Is it true?" she said. "All of it? He said it in front of everyone?" "He did." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, unusual for a woman who filled every space with words. Then she reached out and took Rose's hand and squeezed it. "I am happy for you," she said, "truly." It was the most honest thing Eleanor had ever said to her, and Rose held her sister's hand and smiled and felt the old distance between them begin, very slowly, to close. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe disappeared from the season with a quietness that spoke volumes. She did not attend Almack's again. She was not seen at any of the remaining events. The story that filtered back was that she had gone to stay with relatives in the country, a retreat that, in the language of the Ton, meant her social position had been sufficiently damaged that remaining in London was no longer advisable. Rose did not gloat. She did not celebrate. She simply noted it and moved on, and felt no satisfaction beyond the quiet knowledge that the woman who had tried to destroy her had failed, not through cruelty or revenge, but through the simple fact that Rose had refused to be destroyed. It was, she thought, the best kind of justice, the kind that required no victor and no vanquished, only the truth told clearly in front of everyone who needed to hear it. 5 years later, the gardens at Thornfield Park were magnificent in October, amber and gold in the deep burning red of the old oak trees that lined the drive. Rose stood at the window of the morning room, a cup of tea in her hand, watching the children chase each other across the lawn below. Eleanor, named for Rose's sister, was 4 years old, dark-haired and fierce, with her father's intensity and her mother's quiet stubbornness. James, too, followed his sister with the devoted loyalty of a younger sibling who had not yet learned that admiration was not the same as imitation. Robert appeared in the doorway, and Rose felt his presence the way she always did, a warmth, a steadiness, a point of gravity. He came to stand beside her at the window, and his arm settled around her waist with the easy familiarity of long habit, and they watched their children together in silence. 5 years. Not a long time in the grand sweep of things, and yet Rose felt, looking back at the woman she had been, the quiet, useful, invisible woman in the Ellsworth drawing-room, buttering her toast in silence while her sisters shone, that the distance between that woman and the one she was now was immeasurable, not because her life had become glamorous or extraordinary. It had not. She was still, in many ways, the same person, thoughtful, observant, more comfortable with listening than commanding. But she was no longer invisible, and she was no longer alone. "Are you happy?" Robert asked very quietly. It was a question he asked her sometimes, not because he doubted the answer, but because he had learned that happiness was not something that could be assumed. It had to be checked, renewed. Rose turned her head and looked at him, at the man who had once been the War Duke, who had believed for years that tenderness was weakness, and love was something he could not afford. His face was different now. Not younger. The lines were still there, the shadows on the nights when sleep did not come easily. But softer, more open. The expression of a man who had found, after a very long journey, that the thing he had been running from was also the thing that had been waiting for him. "Yes," Rose said, simply, completely, without qualification. Robert smiled, warm and unguarded, the kind of smile Rose had spent weeks coaxing from him in those first careful days, and now saw every morning as naturally as sunlight. Below them, Eleanor caught James and held him triumphant above her head, laughing with the full-throated joy of childhood, and the autumn light fell golden across the gardens of Thornfield Park, and Rose leaned against her husband's shoulder and closed her eyes. She listened to the sound of her life, imperfect, ordinary, and entirely wonderfully hers,